not initially completely natural and obvious back in the early 1990s within the liberation movement. And finally, one aspect which is very important in Becky's influence is that of the very strong views he held regarding the degree of indigeneity which the models to be followed, to be developed in South Africa should reflect. And that is something that's perhaps less documented than the rest, and it to some extent shed light on the future or the destiny of a number of alternative economic models which were developed in the mid-1990s, and in which, and I'll come back to this when saying a word about the trajectory of these different policy processes, the way in which external foreign experts were very systematically, in fact, or the outcomes, the results of their findings were very systematically rejected. Beyond, of course, Becky's very specific role, the elected affinities of the ANC with business have been documented quite at length, and I'm perhaps not going to delve into this for now, if only to say that our own research and the various interviews that we've conducted all concluded or pointed to the continuation of this proximity between ANC leadership and business. Very citing one of our interviews from Merrill Lynch Bank of America, of very open channels of communication currently between the leadership and business. One very important aspect explaining in our interview's narrative of the reasons behind the choice to continue with the current macroeconomic framework is what we've called the crisis scenario. Is this constant reference to the 1996 currency crisis and attack on speculative attack on the rand at the time, in early 1996, and the fact that this was very decisive, that there was no choice, that the evaluation of risk versus the range of possibilities really constrained the leadership into making very specific choices at the time. This is again something that doesn't really stand scrutiny. A number of commentators have also dismissed this as a valid justification of the longevity of the policies as we've seen them over the past 20 years. What I would like to finish on when considering this dimension of affinities and how it is now to look at how it's impacted the trajectory of policy processes. And what we've been doing is to try and look at the various processes that have been developed in South Africa, at least since 1990. There's no less than 9 of them, and the economists will have them well in mind, from the normative economic model down to new growth paths and the National Development Plan. So we've been looking at all of them, and what the analysis tells us is essentially that you can distinguish between 2 types of processes. On the one hand, you have those processes which have been initiated from within government or the ruling party, and essentially have been designed as a posteriori justifications of decisions which had already been taken with very little public debate or a semblance of public debate, but hardly leading to the incorporation of conclusions into the final document, and very often turned then subsequently into official policy. And that applies to a number of these processes, from the RDP to DIR to the NDP, as we know. After the completion of this paper, which was done before December, we now have a clearer idea of the fact that the NDP has now been adopted as official ANC policy in the coming elections. On the other hand, you have a few other processes. I'm referring here very clearly to MERG, but also to ET or ISP, which were offering alternative models, but which were characterized by the fact that they were, for most of them, deliberative processes and politically grounded, often with very strong academic emphasis on research and evidence gathering, and a degree of transparency in the in the processes, but all resulted in being reported. And what 2 points to be made here in terms of what this tells us. Essentially, on the one hand, you have, over the past 15, 20 years, a trend towards the autonomization away from democratic scrutiny and deliberations of these processes of macroeconomic policy making. And on the other hand, something that's been highlighted also this morning for other sectors, the sort of path dependency in terms of the key dimensions of macroeconomic policy. So I hope I've tried to show that there are a number of long historical trends which have concurred to this neoliberal deepening, and that there's currently this shift away from democratic oversight. But what I'd like to turn to now is the manner in which, in fact, this autonomization of decision-making had to rely on the building of a very powerful technostructure with an ability to not only implement the policies, but also to exert very powerful oversight over the rest of government activity. So turning, and I hope I'll have time to finish there, to the emergence and making and the current key aspects of national treasury as this superstructure. I guess I'd like to say 3 things. Well, essentially, I'd like to distinguish between the making and the emergence of this extremely powerful public administration, and then speak a bit more about contestation since 2007. Undeniably, South Africa has an extremely powerful and efficient national treasury. It's important to remember that, like a competition commission, it was the reform of the state of treasury was already enshrined in the RDP, is enshrined in the Constitution in Chapter 13 of the Constitution, and that's a very important dimension of its legitimacy in the eyes of those who've occupied central positions in it. It's a reform that has been absolutely concurrent with the adoption of GEAR, which was actually initiated in 1995 by a very small group of experts gathered in Cape Town, who were very closely associated with the making of GEAR at the time. And it has resulted in the emergence of a very, very powerful administration in terms of its human resources, in terms of the very high levels of skills which are concentrated and of expertise concentrated within within Treasury. I'm not going to get into figures here, they are in the paper, but another very important aspect is that National Treasury is among the most stable core of public officials in South African public administration. Very, very small turnover rates, with very low vacancy rates. So an administration of highly professionalized top civil servants with very high qualifications. The other important aspect is the making of the systematic construction through legislation of an oversight apparatus, not only allowing obviously the implementation of the macroeconomic framework, but in particular designed to exert maximum oversight over the rest of governmental activity, and I'm referring here specifically to the PFMA, Public Finance Management Act, and the Municipal Finance Management Act, respectively 1999 and 2003. However, this hasn't gone without contestation, also. And I think, as was again referred to this morning, particularly since 2007, there was a sense that there was a growing contestation within the party of this hegemony of national treasury, and in particular of the macroeconomic framework, and a sense that post-2007, post the ANC 2007 policy conference, that there would be more space for the left within the tripartite alliance, particularly for COSATU, to express its views more openly, and for them to be to contribute to the reform of the macroeconomic framework. However, this has remained to date largely ignored, and it's been opposed by the dominant view, which was very prominent in the interviews that we conducted, that macroeconomic policy should remain insulated from the rest of government activity, should be should stand above the fray, if you like, and should be, in other words, depoliticized, and because of its technical nature. I quote one of our interviewers saying that the macroeconomic stability benefited the poor and low-income earners because it paves the way for increased social and education expenditures. These are visible signs of the efficiency of macroeconomic stability. And this completely, in spite of the fact that we have a growing body of research pointing to exactly the contrary. Lastly, what's happened increasingly is the development of a sense both within actually national treasury itself, as well as beyond it within a number of other government departments in charge of micro policies, the sense of double standards. Double standards both in terms of budget allocation, with massive budgetary cuts being imposed by national treasury over a number of departments, but on the other hand, very, very lavish allocations, particularly, for instance, to entities such as SARS. And double standards also in the sense of double standards of oversight and revenue processes. The degree to which micro policies have to respond to a range of criteria in terms of scrutiny is certainly not to be compared with any such standards for any discussions that have to do with macroeconomic policy. Whether it's inflation targeting or capital account liberalization, these hardly ever have to be justified to be reconducted. So I'll conclude by saying that what we hope to have achieved in the paper is to show that the deepening of the neoliberal agenda through the continued adherence to a macroeconomic policy framework is largely a continuation of a range of reforms which had been initiated under apartheid, but which have been actually enforced by an indigenous conservative force within the ruling party, and that the conversion of the leadership has in fact relied very extensively on the capture and the systematic building of a technocratic superstructure, which in the discourses has been in fact built as, or construed as, standing above the fray in a process of depoliticization, to paraphrase Ferguson, of the administration in relation with its role of guardian of the temple in relation with the macroeconomic policy framework. So yes, what we try to do is to debunk a number of the usual myths about the crisis scenario, for instance, or the social or developmental nature of the macroeconomic framework. But what we also try to do, even though we perhaps do not do it as much as we could, and it's probably something to be discussed, is also to try and show the very political nature of the macroeconomic policy framework, of the public administration in charge of its implementation, and hopefully to try and show how depoliticizing it, in fact, results in concealing the class character of a macroeconomic policy framework that has very consistently continued to serve the interest of capital over the past 20 years. Thank you.
The timing was perfect. Dinga, can I ask you to come up? Dinga Sikwebu from Münster, you have 5 minutes.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to Aurelia and thanks to Nicolas for a brilliant paper. I have 5 minutes, which hopefully is to open up things for you to discuss, so I don't have much time. The first thing I just want to say is that in 2006, I did an interview with Professor Estienne Kalitz. Those who know Professor Estienne Kalitz, he was the Director General of the Department of Finance under Apartheid from 1989, and he resigned in 1996. And he had sort of supervised some of the transition. And I interviewed him in 2006 because I was interested in the debate that was happening in the Communist Party and in COSATU about the rise of neoliberalism in South Africa. I was a bit uncomfortable with the overemphasis on 1996 and the gear and what in the language of the Communist Party and COSATU was called the 1996 class project, which put Thabo Mbeki at the center of this. And what I found from this interview, and it's just one interview with Professor Kalitz, is that the turn towards neoliberalism in South Africa goes back into the 80s. And that many of the commissions about trade liberalization, privatization of state-owned assets, labor market reform, these were initiatives initiated in the 80s. And I think that it's important when we talk about neoliberalism to trace it back to that period. Something that's alluded in the paper, I think was made stronger than in the paper in Aurelia's presentation just now. So I grant that one. This going back to the 80s for me is important to both mark what I call the continuities and the discontinuities between the 80s and the 90s. The second thing I wanted to talk about is one of the three, what the paper calls interconnected processes. And this is what is called the sort of ideological conversion. And again, the ideological conversion that's spoken about here is how people from the liberation movement somehow embrace these orthodox policies, mainly pursued by international finance institutions. I can say that in the paper there is the acknowledgement of a similarity between what emerges in the ANC as a result of World Bank, IMF policies, to a policy initiative that happened within COSATU. But I think as a unionist that not much is being made about this. And in fact, there's a distinction that's being made about some of these policies emerging out of COSATU. Just for those maybe who don't know, is that in the late 80s, COSATU initiated what was called an economic trends group, which morphed into what is called the Industrial Strategy Project. And my argument is that some of the sort of flirting with export orientation, opening up of the market, globalization, quite interestingly, it didn't come at that point from the ANC. It came from COSATU, and I would say particularly the white left in COSATU. The white left in COSATU. And if I had more time, I would do a sociological analysis of why this emerged within this group in COSATU. And I think this is important Because if you take my own union, and again, this is about the conversion, NUMSA, for instance, there were about 80 activists, cadre, that left NUMSA to go into various levels of government. There's mention of Alec Ewen. I have a long list of people who went taking some of these policies into government. And I think it's important when we talk about this conversion, not only talk about conversion in the ANC, but also the convergence between the ANC, apparatchiks, and what I call some of this left in the union movement, which had seen Damascus and had changed their own thinking. And for me, this I think is important, and maybe it's not too emphasized in the paper. The two last things I want to say in my 5 minutes, is that the conversion that is spoken about is that it's converting people, but we had a plethora of what we call sort of policy-making structures, from the National Housing Forum to the National Electricity Forum to an agricultural forum, which were all sort of multi-party stakeholder forums, which the unions participated in and some of the activists participated. And I think that some of the legitimation of what I call neoliberal policies also happened to these fora. And if I had more time, I would think about the continuities between them. The last thing I want to say is that, which is there, is that what I got from Professor Khalid, the idea of this independence of Treasury, the independence of the Reserve Bank, was something that they were already discussing in the 80s. They were discussing this in the 80s, and the interesting thing that he said is that in the same time that there was South Africa had relations with Chile, and that some of the monetarism was that, there were sort of diplomatic ties with Chile, and how as the department they had these exchanges with the Chilean officials in the treasury, and that some of the monetarists were training the Chileans were also important. And therefore it's not an accident that both in the interim constitution and in the final constitution, it is the National Party that insisted on this role of the National Treasury and also the issues of the independence of the Reserve Bank. So the point I'm making is that I think the history in dealing with this goes a bit far back, and it's important if we are to see the continuities and discontinuities. And as I've always argued, that the concept of a 1996 project in the Communist Party and in COSATU is a bit of a misnomer. I think we should go back a little bit to understand what's happening in our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Aurelia. I'm tempted to ask my questions first, but I won't. We'll open up the discussion and take 3 at a time.
Before your presentations, I was a bit perturbed by the attribution of all sort of neoliberalism in our country to the leadership of the ANC alone, which brings me back to the question I asked earlier about the end of history. When communism collapsed and capitalism took over or triumphed, Francis Fukuyama said, nothing will ever replace this system. It's a powerful system of capitalism. And I think that's where it also started. Because my faint memory tells me that the ANC was once friends with the communist bloc. So at what time did they start to have this affinity with orthodox economic policies? And my question to you then is, what alternatives do they have? Aren't we pitting Goliath here without a stone and pebble against Goliath? I mean, David against Goliath. When we expect the ANC, or maybe our leadership at that time, to have stood against the liberal onslaught. We had World War I, we had World War II. Cold War, maybe it's about time that we have Cold War II. Because I don't think one small country can actually stand against these major forces of neoliberalism. I look at Zimbabwe, I look at Cuba, I don't know North or South Korea. But you know, they've tried to be stubborn, but they're not going anywhere. What alternatives do we have? Thank you.
Any more questions beforehand for Aurelia and Nicolas? And at the back.
Hi, thanks. A question / comment, which is the links, and it might be in your paper, between what you describe as the depoliticization or the technocratic nature and economic theory. And I find that quite interesting because another way of thinking about that is, besides for the rhetoric of stability, there's also the rhetoric of neutrality, that macroeconomic policy is somehow neutral. Michael Sachs, the head of fiscal policy, makes this point in his submission to last year's Alliance Summit, where he blatantly says macro policy is neutral, and how that scholarly approach then fits into this technocratic kind of nature, whereas in fact it appears that the opposite is actually true, that macro policy has been deeply implicated in the type of restructurings which we've heard, that the liberalization of the economy has been part of financialization, of the deconglomerization, etc. And so the kind of continuation of the growth path and of the structures of power that we've seen seem to have continued in novel form, but that macro policy has been deeply implicated in this and has been far from being neutral.
I'm David from Makumbo Institute. I just want to follow up. Probably there's a question or a comment from what was said by the first question. Was it not a real situation? Sure, it is given that, especially after the Kabul conference, 1985 onwards, economic policy in the ANC evolved from the radical left policy positions that were taken in 1995. This evolved over that period of time, and many reasons account to that. Among others, indeed, could have been the geopolitical position that South Africa found itself. Unlike all the other African countries that gained their independence at the height of the Cold War. Generally, in the 80s, the direction of the global political economy was going to the right. It was neoliberal. The gradual institutions were dictating. Is that not an objective condition enough to consider when you have to thread along those paths? That's the first question. The second question, I gather, I've read some of the articles, but not all of them. I gather that the concern really is not more about the fact that there was a macroeconomic policy that was neoliberal per se. That is also a concern, but also the concern extends to say that it took longer. It stayed for long up until now. The argument is that it could have been arrested earlier and we could have changed course, if that's the argument. The last consideration is that when we do the criticism, which is quite welcome, and I'm sure one of those people who are tired of, I also see the return of some of these people back to Parliament. I'm surprised. Yeah, really, because I think they are bored. They think that they've played golf. Now what next? It's all about boredom sometimes. But anyway, the point is that was also the question of a bankrupt state. Was also the question of a bankrupt state not a real and an objective question? that the economy had to face at the time. You know, in all its guises, you know, the budget deficit, the debt. Sure.
Thank you. Renee, I'll take your question, please.
Thank you for these extremely interesting questions. Let me try and go through a few answers to them. The first one I think goes back to what David was saying. To a large extent, we're not in this paper trying to re-explain why the ANC took a neoliberal turn in the early 1990s. That's done, in fact, extremely well in that special issue by Professor Bill Freud.